Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 32 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Today, our topic is safety and healthy risk-taking. Two really important concepts. This topic has been something I've been thinking a lot about. One of the first books, when Jerry introduced me to this topic, Dr. Bloom, her Sanctuary books were some of the early ones I read. And you know, I've always talked to people about safety, and if you ever hear any talks about safety and trauma-informed care, they usually go hand in hand. But really, I've just, as I've looked at our topic for next week, which is going to be harm reduction, and really other models of change, of psychological growth and post-traumatic growth, safety and the risk-taking piece of it has just really become a real key part of my thinking on this. So I'm excited to explore this topic today with my good friends, Curt and Jerry. And as always, if you're new to the podcast, we always start out with what we call the bright, shiny objects of the week. And this is just sort of what we're thinking about, reading about this week. And I'll start out this week with a book that I'm getting through. It's a pretty long book, but it's really got me thinking, and I think it's really well written. And it's by Dr. Daniel Hughes, Building the Bonds of Attachment. And just a real fascinating book. He uses a case study throughout. And I know Curt and Jerry, a common area where we've all worked is with the foster care system. And I think we would all recognize this young lady who's sort of the main character of this story and just keeps blowing out of one foster home after the other foster home, and this sort of developmental trauma attachment approach that they take with this young lady that's probably familiar to a lot of our listeners as well. And just a really cool model and a really cool way to present it. So I think it's sort of for a niche audience, if you're a therapist or working in the foster care system or a foster parent, which I know we have a lot of those listening to our show every week, not a bad book to pick up. Pretty enjoyable read. And gives a lot of great advice as well. So again, that's Building the Bonds of Attachment by Dr. Hughes. So that is what I'm obsessively working through this week. Curt, what about you? What's your bright, shiny object of the week?
Well, it's allergy season, so if we're talking about bright, shiny objects for what has my attention, that certainly has my attention. But I'm really happy to see the sun out and a lot of the springtime things, and we've talked about that a little bit, but I'm really excited about that. I'm having a good time with being out in the sunshine and enjoying that, and having a lot of fun meeting a lot of new people around the Denver community, and just enjoying being lucky enough to be able to meet so many great people who are doing such great work. It's really fun to hear about, and it energizes me a lot.
Very cool. Yeah, Colorado, I know everywhere I've visited, they say the weather changes. We had a windstorm, I guess. It seemed like a large hurricane that ran over Denver a couple. I unfortunately had the windows open, and my wife got very, very upset at me because we had a dirt beach on our stairs thanks to my decision-making process. So, but beautiful today, sunny, and no hurricanes in the forecast. So, Jerry, what about you? What are you thinking about this week?
I continue to be both inspired and amazed by how hard people work in various areas with children. You know, teachers, people in healthcare, on one hand, and on the other hand, really, in some ways, feel for the level of stress that people are under. Both sides of that they stay committed, but their own health, their own care, and the impacts on teachers, on health providers, how this kind of double-edged sword of caring so deeply and being hurt by the work that we do is, how much health providers carry the suffering of the individual, and collectively as a society, as we struggle with some of these ways in which, as Matt, you started out talking about insurance, it's ways, how do we really take care of the people that are in our clan, and who do we define in our clan, who's not in our clan? And I really admire the commitment that so many people have, and even know that, hopefully some of the trainings we do helps them to manage what they're doing in a better way. So being committed and compassionate, but really stopping and having a level of compassion for yourself. So I'm always, each week I get to work with people is just inspired by how much good there is in the world.
Absolutely. And always a great reminder to do this work and do it effectively. We've got to prioritize our own well-being and self-care. If we're burned out and traumatized, not only do we struggle to do good, but we can do harm too. So we got to prioritize that. And we're worthy of it too. And I know that sometimes folks in our field, taking care of yourself is something we don't seem to be all that great at times. We're great at taking care of others, but ourselves, turning that mirror towards ourselves can be a little difficult. So always a great reminder to make sure we prioritize our self-care going forward. So the topic today, to shift into that, I think most of us know what physical safety is. I want to take a deeper dive into a concept of psychological safety, but physical safety in some ways, if we're going to talk about post-traumatic growth, if we're going to talk about behavioral change, that for so many people, especially folks that may not have a high level of physical safety, is probably the number one issue for most people that we need to address before anything else is how do we build that safety in their life. So Curt, I just want to start out with you and your experiences. When you look at the role of physical safety and behavioral changes, the healing process, I just want to get some of your thoughts initially on the importance that plays in people's lives, and again, with some of those critical changes and healing processes they're trying to achieve.
I think probably the major reason why this is such a big topic in the field of treating individuals who've experienced trauma is that the experience of trauma is really a violation of physical safety, and that is where it all begins. And so talking about establishing or reestablishing safety becomes a central theme to even talking about how do we interact with people who've experienced adverse childhood experiences or overwhelming stress. And certainly from a physiological, neurobiological and developmental perspective, that's one of the ways that our bodies or our biological systems have evolved is in order to keep us safe. And so that understanding that, I think, is really important when we talk about from a kind of the behavior change perspective, right? We talk about functions of behavior, and one of those functions can often be safety related. And that can be what drives both changes in our biology, which can certainly drive changes in our behavior, which is to keep our bodies safe and keep us in a position where we can take more risks later because we're safe now. While you were talking about safety, it reminds me of something my mother used to say to me all the time. I was kind of a risk taker of a kid. There's a shocker, I know. And my mom
that long hair that gives it away.
My mother would always say to me, Curt, would you rather be safe or would you rather be happy? Which was a really interesting question for me as a child. I was always like, as a younger man, I was always like, I would rather be happy all day long. I'm going to take every risk. As I got older, I was like, wait a minute, maybe I thought I should rethink that a little bit and balance out the risks that I was going to take a little. I think it was the happiest day of my mom's life when I looked at her one day and I said, actually, I think maybe being safe could be being happy too.
Yes.
When I could kind of hold both sides of that question, she was very happy that day.
She got the behavioral change and thinking change she was looking for.
Like, oh my goodness, all of my years of pain have paid off a little bit with this one.
Jerry, I know this is something, especially again, all of us, but you longer than Curt and I have really, with your work in residential care, tried to create physically safe spaces for kids coming out of some pretty dangerous situations when we talk about their communities or their home life. And I just over time, with your thinking about trauma, I'm interested to see your thoughts on the importance and the role of physical safety in both change and healing.
I think the easiest level of this discussion today is physical safety. And when you're dealing with children, adolescents, or adults who struggle with both emotional safety and social safety, we begin by addressing the first level of that, which is physical safety, right? And so for many of the youth I had the opportunity and honor to kind of work with, it was really important to kind of create some safe harbor, some place that they could be where those things that hurt them, whether it be the gangs, whether it be family threats or other perpetrators that have been in their lives, that we would create some type of boundary that within that they could hopefully begin to let down some of their armor. People develop strategies to live in worlds in which there's constant physical danger. And so by recognizing that and focusing initially on creating a place where your physical body is going to be respected and protected is a very important, I think, first level of intervention that we look at. And sometimes that's doing it for the youth, and sometimes that's doing it for the youth and their caretaker. Oftentimes in these situations, a caretaker can't start caretaking until they feel some level of physical, emotional, and social safety. So kind of creating that kind of space for some healing and some growth to occur, physical safety becomes an important component of that.
Yeah. And I think my thinking around this has just increased so dramatically, especially, working with juvenile justice, child welfare, residential, and in school settings. I had so much control over sometimes 24/7 the environment that my clients, mostly children and young adults, were living in. Now, sometimes that was a safe, regulated environment. Other times it wasn't. But I had a lot of control. And then working then with folks experiencing homelessness, where their physical safety, maybe outside the hour or so they're maybe in a clinic or in therapy, is really always at risk. Now that they've learned to survive, that in some way becomes their normal, these sort of things. But it just has really shown me how little in some ways, and amazing changes do happen, but in some ways, how hard it is to make any sort of behavioral change if physical safety has to be your priority for basically 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And even maybe sleeping in a shelter doesn't always feel safe. So there's this constant, as we talked about last week, hyper aroused state, because I always have to see where that next danger is going to come out of. And when with me, and you guys know me fairly well right now, when I go to that extreme, then I can kind of step back and see, some of the kids that I worked with in school settings where they went home at night, if that wasn't safe, how that really limited our impact during the day. And it just became more and more of a priority for me in my work is, okay, how do we increase just even little steps? Again, we'd love everybody experiencing, or at least I would, everybody experiencing homelessness to be housed in a safe environment. That's the goal. But knowing that that's not possible for a variety of reasons, what little steps can we take to increase physical safety? And it's really helped me, I think, help in my work now as a consultant, how people think. And again, harm reduction will be our topic next week. How do we decrease harm and increase safety? And that balance is often where I suggest people start their thinking around this piece. And that's, I think, really given me a good focus to help. And the neurobiology, I think, that I read really supports that as well.
It's a
central concept, I think, to this idea of safety, and this may lead us into other areas of safety beyond physical safety, is also predictability. Mm-hmm. We know about how the exposure to stressful events and the pattern of that exposure is important in whether or not stress creates resilience or whether or not stress creates vulnerability. And when we have stressors that are unpredictable and extreme, then that pattern of exposure creates sensitization instead of some aspect of resilience. And we need stress to do both, right? It's not like we can just avoid any kind of stressors. That would be really us not getting organized by anything that's happening in the environment. So there's a side too of talking about stress and talking about vulnerability. That is that stress is also required to create resilience. Just it's required in the right pattern, in the right dosage, and with the right level of support. And I think that kind of leads into other areas of safety around this concept of predictability.
Yeah.
So when we start thinking about how do we establish safety with someone who has just left an environment in which they've been traumatized or have a life history in which they've been traumatized, one of the best things that we can do is to create an environment that has a predictable pattern of especially positive repetitive experiences, right? That in and of itself is really a bedrock of trauma treatment, as I see it, and of trauma-informed services and care that we can do in kind of the way you were saying, Matt, one little experience at a time, right? And every single one of those it can be a very positive one.
Jerry, I'd love to get your thoughts on what Curt said about that role of predictability, and let's throw out the role of psychological safety. And I think we can break safety down into a lot of ways. I've started to use psychological safety as sort of an umbrella term for emotional and social safety, but Jerry, I'll give you the ability if you want to separate those as well. But just that predictability in the environment, and I also think with psychological safety, predictability in the relationship as well that we start to create with clients and patients that we work with too.
So a couple of thoughts. One, going back to Curt's mother. Because it always goes back to the mother, right? You know.
I'm gonna text my mom right now and tell her we're talking about
Let's do some free association work.
Right. This is so really. Curt's mom was really very wise, right? So she's trying to tell Curt, in the world you have to both feel and you have to deal. So you have to learn how to balance out exploration and risk-taking with feeling and managing, and she's kind of letting him explore and find that himself. But this concept of being able to both hold your emotional states and feelings and to be able to go out in the world and explore, not one or the other. And that is a really important component of forming a secure attachment. Kind of looking at that, right? Is that this concept of being able to return to this safe haven, manage your feelings, and then go out in the world to kind of look at that, right? And so when we think about social and emotional safety, one component of that is being in a relationship where there's reciprocity. It's not being in the presence of another human being that's a relationship. It's about somebody seeing you, knowing you, hearing you, and interacting with you so that you begin to realize that in this relationship, I develop a rhythm, I develop a capacity to be with other people and see them as a resource, but also I don't get lost in that relationship. So that when we look at social safety, is many people who have been traumatized have not had that experience of reciprocity or have been objectified in some ways. And so they're out of sync in some ways with interactions. So relationships do not become a safe place to be able either to come back to when I'm needing something or to feel like I can leave without being rejected or abandoned, kind of looking at that. And so that's really how I kind of understand this safety, social component of this.
Yeah.
The emotional component of this is that people who are traumatized really are very frightened of their emotional states. They have not served them well. They've overwhelmed them. And so emotional safety really is to be able to be safe with your internal experiences, right? And so this concept of creating physical safety, beginning to understand that we have to learn how to be in a relationship, in a reciprocal relationship where I can feel what you feel, but I'm not overwhelmed by what you feel, and that you can read my cues. And going back to this consistency and predictability as I learn how to have nonverbal communication. And eventually also is that I begin to develop the internal capacity to manage what comes up from me, my memories, my emotions, my impulses, all of those capacities, and that I feel in some ways, as you would talk about it, worthy. I look in somebody's eyes and they see me as worthy. They see me as special. Is that, oftentimes people say is you can't love other people until you love yourself. Well, really it starts out, we can't love ourselves until somebody loves us. Mm-hmm. Right? And so in a way, those three components of the treatment process of any type of relationship become really important. And some of us who've had those experiences, just like many of our other functions, when they're working really well, we don't see them, right? So when things are broken down, it's very important that we pay particular attention to all three of those components. And that's, I think we can absorb them into psychological safety, which is important, but really realize some of our clients have no difficulty coming with you, but they're very defensive about their internal states. Mm-hmm. Other people could share their emotions, but they don't really know how to be in a relationship with you. And then there's other people who constantly, because they can't read their internal cues and they can't read external cues, they continue to put themselves in dangerous situations. So physical safety becomes an issue. So really holding all these components in our mind as we begin to, in some ways, create the opportunity for some of the people who have been hurt to begin to heal and grow.
Great. Curt,
Jerry, when you were talking about the experience of individuals who have not experienced a lot of emotional safety, right? They get fearful of their internal state and fearful of emotions. It made me think of how the concept of dysregulation is, I think, important here, right? That a dysregulated system is one that doesn't have any rhythm to it. And so it can fluctuate up and down, and we can go through from the internal state side of things. We're going way up the arousal continuum, way down the arousal continuum without being organized by any kind of pattern or any kind of rhythm. So when we think about, I think, especially children who come into environments where we get a chance to interact with them, schools, in treatment centers, even in outpatient and any of that, creating some kind of pattern where their system can organize around it. And I think one of the ways that we think about that, as you were talking, I was thinking about that's what a really good attuned caregiver can do. is to be able to give that kind of a pattern that a child can organize around, and that can regulate a dysregulated system. And yeah, so I was thinking that while you were talking, and I've been thinking a lot about environmental design a lot lately, and how do we get a lot of the people who you were describing earlier, people who are working so hard to treat children. And one of the real binds that I think that they get in is we accept a new child into an environment with a collection of other kids who all have problems feeling safe together. And then like we as caregivers are in a position where we're like, we've got to create some kind of safety. And the real urge there is to create an environment where limits are set very, very intensely in an effort to try and maintain and establish some safety. And one of the things I've been trying to kind of switch folks' thinking a little bit around is to design an environment around positive repetitive events, rather than waiting for signs of a dysregulated individual within a dysregulated environment and then react to that. So the shift towards being a little more proactive about environmental design rather than reactive in the effort that it then takes to completely regulate a dysregulated individual, we can mitigate some of that by designing our environments a little bit differently. Some thoughts I had while you were talking, and would love to get some of both of your perspectives on either environments where you've done that successfully, or some of experiences over the years of having been in a lot of different places and with a lot of different types of people who've undergone a lot of overwhelming stress, about creating that kind of pattern. Anything that you found, some tricks or little things that you've come across, you're like, oh, that was a good one, I need to share that, over the years that come to mind thinking about that.
Yeah, one of the things that I really, and I think a lot of my work with, that has taught me a lot, is with HIV case managers. Because a lot of times folks with HIV, and early on I found out that when you talk about HIV case managers, having the disease of HIV is usually not one of the 5 top things that they're dealing with. So you can think about it, here's a disease that could kill you if you don't treat it right. And yet things like addiction, housing, mental health issues, poverty, all supersede that. And so many of these folks, and I get this with the work with homeless providers as well, they're not ready to take the mental health referral. So we have these folks that are holding so much intensity as far as mental health and addiction. And it's really with safety is how do you start to take those little steps, and how do you find time, as both of you are talking about, to create, maybe we don't call it a therapeutic relationship, though it is a therapeutic relationship in my book. How do you take time with all the assessments that you have to do, with all the referrals you have to make? If you're that one person in their life, how do you find time to build that relationship, so you're addressing some of that psychological safety as well? And the good thing is we have pretty simple, motivational interviewing gives us the open-ended questions, reflections, summaries, and affirmations. So we have some pretty simple models of reflective listening that we know are really effective in doing that and showing people that they're being heard, as kind of Jerry said, is that they are important, that they're important enough, or they're worthy enough as a person for me to take time to hear you. It just really frustrates me in our traditional models that I often walk into, creating that psychological safety. There's not enough recognition of that importance that we give people time to do that. And if we know the case manager or the outreach worker doesn't have enough time to really build that healthy, safe relationship, it's less likely that they'll take that warm handoff then, as we call it in public health, to the physician, to the therapist, later on down the line, to get some of those other key resources that they need. So I try to have people think about the physical safety, think about the relationship just on the same level as helping somebody increase the physical safety in their life. That is just as important as some of the resources that we give. And the relationship, if you really think deep about it, the way I do, is that's as life-saving as any resource that we're going to give somebody, because we'll often keep them in care, keep them in the system long enough to hopefully address some of the issues, including hopefully getting them into trauma-specific treatment to get over some of that past stuff. So absolutely critical in my thinking, and hope really trying to have people think about how do we give folks time to really build that in a meaningful way. Jerry, what are some of your thoughts on this?
You raise some really good questions, Curt, and both you, Matt, in terms of the power of that relationship. You know, I think your concept of increasing positive experiences is a really interesting one, right? Because one of the things that kind of gets lost sometimes is positive experiences increase arousal levels. And we have to teach people to manage increasing positive arousal and amplifying as much as we have to help them soothe painful feelings, right? And so in a healthy, good relationship, in that first year of life, really what a caretaker is mostly doing is helping that child when they get dysregulated in painful states to kind of settle down and kind of soothe them, right? And also in their interactions with them, facial and smiling, is engaging in positive, nonverbal, reciprocal interactions. And when the child gets overwhelmed with that and turns away, or is the caregiver is sensitive to that, reads those cues and allows the child to turn away, manage that state, and come back, right? And so there's this balance. So in this first year, you both have amplifying positive experiences, but you also have the availability of a regulating other to help you to manage when those internal experiences get too much, right? So what you're basically doing, going back to Curt's concept of sensitization of nervous system, is when you have this nice interaction where there's increasing positive affective arousal and then down, is you begin to create tolerance. So you can handle higher arousal levels and be able to kind of bring it down. So your tolerance gets greater, right? In the second year of life, we add a component because it's not just about needs anymore, there's wants, right? As I go out there and as Curt went out and started to take risks and kind of to do, I'm sure mom had to move from just making him feel better and amplifying positives to setting limits on him, right? So now when she sets limits, she moves him from a positive affect state, because when he's exploring and getting in trouble and getting into something he's not feeling bad, he has a positive affect state. Mom comes along, or dad comes along, or somebody, teacher comes along, or therapist comes, or whatever it is, and sets a limit and quickly moves that person into a negative affect state. Mm-hmm. So the caregiver has to be attuned to they change states, and a good caregiver is going to now move to, I'm going to help you regulate that state. So that we all have to learn how to manage amplifying positive states, but also when we move to a negative state, how we can develop the capacity to soothe ourselves and move back to a positive. So this concept of limits is that limits in themselves create safety, but they also create high levels of internal distress. So a caregiver has to both be able to set limits and be able to hold and help the child manage those limits that were set, to kind of look at that piece. And I think that that's often and as we get older, we have to kind of do that ourselves, right? To kind of look at that. And when we haven't had that reciprocity of both being able to have the experience of having amplified positive states and being regulated, or when we get down in negative states, being able to recover from those negative states, we find alternative strategies to accomplish that. And some of those things are the very symptoms, Matt, that people come into those clinics for, that we're trying to tell them, you know what, you're here to, the reason you have HIV is you engaged in the sexual behavior and we want to kind of help you and kind of, but really what, if they could, they'd say is that's what makes me manage my states.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think, or the kids that come into treatment and we put them in these environments, we're trying to get them to get rid of these things that got them there, but those are the things that they have learned how to survive with.
Yeah.
Right. And so we need this kind of, not to get confused with creating structure, predictability, and consistency with being punitive and kind of reactive and kind of, oftentimes in these environments, that's what happens. There's a confusion that the structure and predictability that I'm providing you to help you, when you're not able to effectively utilize it, I become the administrator of distress to you, right? Instead of kind of working within that to help you to kind of make best use of those resources that are around you. Yeah. So I think that as we learn more about how the brain develops and how it develops in the context of relationships and how we can kind of use that to kind of, in some ways, whether it be drumming or whether it be, some type of bicycle riding or swimming or some positive experience, but understanding when some of our clients are engaged in that, they're starting to get, oh, I feel really good. Now I can't manage this state, right? And so instead of coming in and just setting a limit, I've got to be able to help that child or adult manage that. If not, the very act of having fun becomes a potential threat that that's going to happen.
Right.
That's my answer to your question, Curt, is that yes, in life we want to be able to both experience happiness and joy and the satisfaction of coming from just being alive and being in the world, but also be able to handle those ups and downs and to be able to manage those things, to kind of look at that. Does that answer that question?
When you were talking about this concept of the things that really have essentially, if we're talking about going to a school outside of a public school, right? You kind of have to fail into that environment, right? You got to engage in a lot of things that get you out of a public school into a kind of a non-public setting, or a residential setting, or any of those things. You're engaging in behavior or symptoms that help you to manage your state. And one of the ways or the areas where I've seen that most frequently kind of play out for me is in treating people who engage in self-injury, right? And that we, as the treatment professionals and people around who care about that person, are constantly asking people to give up self-injury when self-injury has been what they have used to cope. And that sets up this kind of disconnect between what we want and the person that we're treating is really like, well, what am I going to do if I don't do that? And then I'm going to have to give that up. And I'm not going to be able to manage my social world. I'm not going to be able to manage my emotional world, and I'm not going to be safe anymore. Even though that is a very concerning behavior that is a threat to safety for all of us around that person. So you're making me think of that as we were talking about that, using certain things to manage states, I think is a great lens to view a lot of the symptoms that we see through. It's been a really useful one for me over the years.
Yeah. The one last thing I want to, because I do want to get to talking about the risk-taking piece of this, but there was another piece, I think it was David Rock who I read this from, but I might get that wrong. It's been a while, but he talked about these two chemicals in our body, and he looked at these things, and what he saw in the science, which I've sort of seen hinted about in other places, is oxytocin, which is really that when we feel like we're being heard, when we're in that, in many ways, I see it as the chemical behind the feeling of trust and psychological safety, is that we know oxytocin allows us to be in our window of tolerance, to be regulated and connected and in sync with and in tune with other human beings. And then what he saw in the research and what I think others have seen as well is there's this sort of opposite chemical called dihydrotestosterone, which really prepares us for sort of that fight or flight response. And it really started to make me think about who's walking through our doors, whether it's the school you mentioned, Curt, whether it's a clinic. And I used to sort of think back in early on in my career is that people sort of walked in a neutral state. Is they like, you know, they walk in and they first meet me, it would be like me meeting a physician for the first time. It's like, yeah, we're not best friends or anything yet, but I don't think you're going to hurt me. I don't think you're going to do me harm, but what we've seen and what some studies have measured when I don't know how they draw blood out of people, because that would stress me out if I had to just give blood as soon as I walked into somewhere. But as they do these studies, what they see is this really high rate of dihydrotestosterone with folks experiencing trauma, homelessness, addiction, because they've had such bad experiences both with other people and with other people in the service delivery system. Whereas in Curt, your example with the schools, these kids have already failed out of maybe multiple school settings before they get into this one. So again, it's not sort of a baseline of neutrality, but they walk in sort of ready to have to be defensive to engage in some of those behaviors. So that really also helped me from a real nerdy kind of biochemical aspect to say, why sometimes people aren't walking in with kind of this neutral level psychological safety. Whether they can verbalize it or not, might actually be afraid to connect with us because they've been hurt before. So I just think it shows the complexity, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a therapist, is we're really working with somebody who has in many ways learned not to trust people and that people can be dangerous. And so it just, again, that focus, that time to create the relationship and psychological safety, again, is I think just from a chemical perspective as well, getting that oxytocin is such a critical part of the healing process too. So I want to build upon that and talk about healthy risk taking. And I want to throw out the definition that I've thought about, because again, this was just a bullet point on when I talk about safety. There's risk taking, but risk taking in some ways is probably what Curt used to do, jumping out of airplanes or doing snowboard jumps or whatever Curt does. Yeah, I know Jerry's got some stories too that we probably won't get into, because that's a whole different episode about Jerry's risk taking in his youth. But there's some stories there, my friends. But these are, so I put that on the slide, and after I do a bullet point for about 1,000 times in my presentations, I really started to think about this in a deeper way. And I started to understand the risk, especially when you think about the dihydrotestosterone, oxytocin, past experiences, is that for some people walking through our doors for services is a risk. For a lot of people, taking the mental health referral is a risk because they know they're probably going to have to talk about their trauma at some point. Re-engaging in services, going into a housing program. So the risk for me, when I think about a risk taking, that's one thing. But when I thought about just those, what may seem like little steps from our perspective are actually really huge steps. And what's coming out of the research is the safer we feel, the more likely we are to take some of those healthy risks. And I just like to, again, that's been a real powerful thing behind my thinking and teaching lately. And I just love to get, maybe Jerry, start out with you on this, just sort of your perspective on thinking around this healthy risk taking with folks in our services.
Risk is a really interesting process, right? Because in some ways, starting from really early, being separate but connected requires some level of risk, right? You got to go out. We talk about, when you create some sense of safety and security, the children naturally want to explore the world and want to grow and to do, and there's some natural. So this concept of being close and held and doing it and then going out in the world, you not only do you have to take a risk, but the caretaker has to feel safe enough to let you kind of do that, to kind of manages that. So risk is a really important part of development. of balancing out, going out in the world and exploring and decreasing safety in some ways to kind of do it. But in order to do that in a healthy way, you need a number of things. One is you need to be able to read your internal cues and external cues. Is there danger out there? And is my level of anxiety getting too great? And if it does, I've got to be able to signal a caregiver to be able to kind of come and be available to me to help me to kind of do it. So in development, we try to balance those things, right? So I can go out in the world, but I also know if the world gets scary or overwhelming, I need somebody who's bigger, wiser, and stronger that's available to help me with that part of it, to kind of look at it, right? And so healthy exploration and risk-taking requires some of that, right? And at different times of our lives, adolescents tend to, right? Think about adolescence and risk-taking, is that their biochemistry is changed in such a way that they're wired to take risks. That when they're not doing something, their dopamine levels in their bodies are low and they're feeling bored, right? And they weigh rewards way more heavily than consequences. So they're designed to go out in the world and change the world and see different things and kind of do it, right? Adults weigh consequences more than they do rewards. So by the very nature of adolescence, it creates distress in adults because we're wired differently, right? We're thinking about, if you go out and do this, you're going to get hurt, so you should do it. Adolescents are going, oh my God, that's an opportunity for me to feel rewarding and kind of doing, right? They're seeing the world differently. So I think that in a healthy kind of way, there's an adult who kind of helps the adolescent stop and look at some of these things. And then there's the adolescent who pushes and goes and does things that the adult kind of, that's healthy. So even in risk-taking, there's this reciprocity between the people who are caring for you and me pushing away from that to kind of looking at that, right? So that's healthy caregiving. So I need an adult who can manage some of their anxiety of letting me go and do it, but not abandon me and let me get so hurt and out of control out there to kind of manage, right? So I think, and so lots of the individuals that we work with, they take risks, and because of their experiences, they're not very sensitive to their internal cues that there's danger out there. So they find themselves in situations that are really harmful. But they also haven't had either the availability or because of their history can't make use of individuals outside that help them look at these things to kind of, so either people have been not available or they've been controlling, and so there hasn't been a healthy relationship to kind of manage some of those things.
Yeah.
So when we look at healthy risk, we have to look at it within the individual, their capacity, but also is there the environment that allows that person to almost have a safety net to be able to take some of these risks without, if I fall, I'm not going to fall and hurt myself. I fall and there's somebody there to hold me to kind of look at that. Yeah. And I think that that's the balance that for some of us, like Curt, he had a healthy level of risk that he could take. And there was somebody there to kind of talk to him about that. But really, lots of my clients that I've worked with over the years, they get in situations and all of a sudden something happens to them and they missed out on certain cues that they weren't even aware they were in dangerous situations. Mm-hmm. So they didn't even know they were taking a risk.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the challenge when we are working with individuals who we're trying to kind of talk about risk with them.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily see it as a risk.
And I think it's fascinating. You bring up such a good point is like, I think for the three of us to say, hey, let's go to the most dangerous part of town tonight and just sleep outside, right? I would even for Curt, that would probably seem a little risky, right? We're just going to sleep outside. No tent. We're just going to find a nice place in the park and sleep outside in the highest crime rate area in our city. So when we think about the risk taking, Jerry, I think you bring up a great point and I see this a lot too, unfortunately, in like domestic violence situations where all you've known is that abusive relationship and everybody from the outside can see, boy, you're falling into that pattern to go with, you see these things go. And so for somebody, and again, this is where working with homeless providers have taught me so much about safety is they feel safe. It's just the opposite for me. For me to go to a therapist wouldn't seem necessarily like a risk, would seem something I would do for my mental health. But for somebody who may have had bad experiences in the system, going to their first mental health appointment might seem a lot more risky than sleeping outside in the most dangerous part of a metropolitan area. So again, I think when we look at these healthy risk-taking, we really have to get, our empathy and understanding of their mindset around this, because a risk for them might be something that we would see as a normal everyday activity. We may look at some of their behaviors as the riskiest things we might do all year. So again, trauma sort of flips that logic on its head. Curt, what do you think about all this?
It's the two sides of habit. And on the one sense, habits are really useful because they're efficient. Mm-hmm. And they can make us really, really effective in that we don't have to use so much energy and we can have kind of automatic responses to deal with common problems. We can be really good at it. There are also, the other side of it is that it can be frightening to do something different than what we're used to doing. And that even going away from a habit, which is a habit kind of by definition is something that we're not thinking about, that is a risk. And taking that risk is oftentimes something that we have to do something different.
Yeah. And those are things like, for some people, sharing needles. It becomes like habits in some way become safe, right? Because we've repeated them so many times. So again, things that we look from the outside perspective as being high risk, they may see as low risk, and things we see as, hey, like going to the doctor for us doesn't seem like a very risky thing to do, might be incredibly risky for somebody that's just had those negative experiences in the system before. So, Jerry, any other final kind of thoughts on this before we wrap up?
I think the really what it comes down to is how well regulated we are as providers, and really being attuned to how do we take a risk with our clients and how do we manage that risk, right? And so trauma work really is, I can go in and kind of intrude on you and bring my needs to you, or I could avoid your trauma, right? So how do I manage the risk in these relationships, and how do I feel safe enough as a provider, as a therapist, as a teacher, as a foster parent? How do I manage my internal experience, the physical safety, the psychological, and the social safety in my environment, so that I can provide what this other needs to heal and grow? And I've gone into organizations so often, and organization structure who deals with high-risk clients, child welfare, mental health, homeless or AIDS. So many of the people in administration get so focused on the safety of the population that's being treated and miss that their people providing these need the same level of attunement and responsiveness and kind of looking at it and predictability. And so a new administrator comes into an organization and says, oh, in order to best kind of fundraise and do it, I got to go meet the kids, or I got to go meet the population. Instead of coming in and saying, how do I provide the safety and support to my staff so that they could do this for the people that they serve? Yeah. And so I think that it's not about pathology. It's about being human, and it's about being a mammal. Is that when we feel safe, when we feel responded to, when there's some reciprocity, we could stay in a social engagement state that allows us to do all the things we're saying. When we feel threatened, we move to defensive strategies, and that defensive strategies oftentimes is counter-aggressive, so that the people actually providing the kind of service are fairly aggressive. And it's because they don't feel safe.
Yeah.
So, Sandra Bloom or some other, or Daniel Hughes talks also about how to make caregivers feel safe so they could provide the caring.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the takeaway today is it's not about pathology, it's about biology.
Absolutely. And I just want to reinforce, we start out, Jerry, with the self-care statement. And I like, when I talk to people, especially leadership, about organizational culture, I really challenge them. What do your clients, your patients, your students feel when they walk through the door? Because I think, especially with folks that are in that survival state, if there's dysfunction between us, they're going to pick up on it. Now, they may not be able to verbalize it and say, your organizational culture seems very unhealthy today. But at the same time, they will be able to feel that.
The world is intruding.
I'm calling that.
I know. Sorry about that. It's somebody from my own phone number, so I'm sure it's very important. But there is that piece of culture, and just to kind of reinforce this importance, I thought this was one of the more powerful studies in business that I've seen lately. Is Google spent a lot of money, probably most of our budgets for the year, to study what's the #1 predictor of team success within the Google environment. And they found that the #1 predictor of success in their teams was psychological safety. And again, that can kind of freak out an MBA that I went to school for, because we want a real concrete thing like a strategic plan that we can easily pay a consultant to come and do. But again, we, as Jerry said, it's just a reminder that we all thrive in healthy relationships. We all thrive in safe relationships.
Matt, one last comment I want to make about this, that I think we said it, but we didn't say it really clear. Cultural safety is an important piece too.
Good point.
And that, people are coming for us to help who not only in their own lives, but in their parents' lives and in their grandparents, and is this act of being with somebody from the dominant culture has not resulted in positive experiences.
Yeah.
So that we have to be always aware that the cultural dynamic is a very important component, and recognize it, naming it, and really understanding it, of creating some level of safety for individuals to make use of the experience.
Absolutely. And an important message to end on as well. So again, this is sort of part one of a two-part exploration of safety. We have two great experts who combine training on a concept and a philosophy called harm reduction with trauma-informed care. And if you're not familiar with harm reduction, I really encourage you to tune in for our next episode, because this is really, I didn't get exposed to this in early on in my career in child welfare, juvenile justice, or education. But when I went into the public health arena, I was like, oh, this is what we were missing a lot of times. And so we'll have James and Susie on next week for a real deep dive into that, of how do you take, as you can tell from this conversation, a critical aspect of trauma-informed care, of post-traumatic growth, and really take a system and look at it of how do we create interventions, programming, and cultures around this concept of harm reduction. So please join us next week as well for sort of the part 2 of this conversation, especially if you're not familiar with the concept. If you are, we'll really connect that with you with the trauma-informed lens as well. So Jerry and Curt, as always, had a blast, learned a lot. And for our listeners, if you want to go to traumainformedlens.org, you can find videos with our smiling faces, see my holy bleep face when my phone rings during a podcast, and also resources. And we also, again, put discussion questions on there as well. So if you want to have your team listen to this and then have some follow-up questions, we give those to you as well. So we'll see everybody next week. And thank you again so much for your time and the work that you do every day. Thanks.